I mean, I suppose it does kind of clicking on the link. Yeah, because that's an annoying thing that's been happening with Substack itself, where everyone is joined.
Got the live stream.
Oh.
It's like the highlight.
The mics are hot. Okay, huge. Thank you. Okay, Thank you so much.
One of these guys has got really good today he posted
Do you want some help?
No, I think we're good.
Okay.
Okay. Is this all right, Gigi?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the launch of this really, really fucking good book. Am I allowed to swear? I think I'm probably allowed to swear. Yeah, it's a book about sex. Like, we can swear. I'm so excited to be joined here by Xuanlin Tham, who is one of my very, very good friends, also the best writer that I know. We talk about it all the time in secret, all of us. So they are a film critic, a writer, a programmer at Take One Action. They've written for the likes of GQ, Another Magazine, Little White Lies, all over the place. They're very, very great. And this book is incredible. So please join me in welcoming them. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for coming or for being here. It's like so nice, like Anahit said, to see so many faces that I recognize, and in a city that I've lived in for now 7 years. So it feels really, really nice to be here. This is the first bookshop that I ever walked into in Edinburgh 7 years ago. So full circle.
Now you're fixing it, which is so sweet. So you were going to do a reading?
Yes.
So we're going to kick off with that.
Cool.
I'm so scared that I'm going to trip you
Yeah,
up in some
I'm
way.
so sorry.
No, that's okay. As long as you're fine.
I'm in like a bear trap.
Yeah, exactly.
So I thought I would start with reading a bit from the 4th chapter of my book, which is about the queer sex scene against representation. So, yes. Oh, yes, of course. I'm going to start, I think, from page 65. Difficult. But
Do you want me to hold it for you?
would that be?
No, I think that'd be
oh my
cute.
gosh, thank you so
I think
much.
that'd be nice.
Thank you. Okay, so art and culture is shaped by what we imagine to be possible, and what we imagine to be possible is shaped by art and culture. But today, when we talk about this feedback loop of possibility in relation to queer art, we seem unable to escape the discursive confines of representation, which has become our primary tool for parsing media by or depicting anyone other than the cishet white man. Art for or by the marginalized is now largely evaluated through this lens. How good is this work at including previously excluded identities, and even better, in the mainstream? Representation has become a conceptual cudgel, a statistic-motivated exercise that entails a strange virtue-signaling logic. How many times has Pixar or Disney announced that so-and-so is the first gay character in the so-and-so franchise? The logic of representation has given us many cases like Officer Spectre, the animated lesbian troll cop, voiced by Lena Waithe in 2020's Onward. The Zootopia antelopes, who were apparently the first ever gay couple in a Disney film. or the much marketed first gay kiss in the Star Wars universe in The Rise of Skywalker. Between two unnamed extras, the kiss was less than a second long and swiftly and easily cut when screened in countries where it would have threatened the studio's bottom line. Unsurprisingly, an increase in queer representation has not meant more queer sex on screen. In exchange for inclusion in the mainstream, queer sexuality has been desexed so it can be put on sale. Queerness is to be tolerated if it is merely nominal, unchallenging to dominant and heteronormative structures. It is to be falsely, voraciously embraced if there is money to be made in doing so. This is not to deny that seeing queerness on screen can be powerful and transformative, especially beyond these more cynical examples. But the regime of representation prescribes our relationship to art and reduces it to a stilted transaction, where all we need is to see ourselves in that queer person on screen, to flatten our multiplicity and bring our identities and desires into conformity with what has already been chosen for us. Instead of queerness being something we internally sense, something originating in our bodies about what we feel and what we want, we are coaxed into aligning ourselves with fixed and commodifiable ideas of queer identity. Should I just stop there for now? Okay, I would do a little bit later, but it's okay. Little teaser.
We're really doing this on the fly. So yeah, I should have said before, I might keep glancing at my phone just to make sure that there is enough time for you guys to ask questions at the end. So please think them up. But to begin with, so I want to come back to this idea of representation because you talk about it really, really well. But first of all, I want to begin by asking if you can tell me about your journey with horny cinema, generally, horniness in cinema, and especially if you see horniness predominantly as a lens or as a genre.
Oh, that's a really good question. I think definitely as a lens, yeah. I think my sort of relationship with sex on screen or like sex in media in general, I don't think I ever set out to be someone who's really obsessed with sex, but here I am. And I write about this a little bit in the book, but I was like thinking back to when this all started for me. And I remember some of like my first encounters, like watching something that felt quite illicit with like my parents and them having to be like, oh, well, fast forward the like past the sex scene, and the way that sort of illicitness actually made you want to know why, and it, on some level already feel like, oh, this interest that I have is maybe a little bit questionable, and why is it questionable? And then I talk also about like how my first encounters with things like watching the sex scene in Carol, it's like in this like little minimized window on my laptop screen while I was supposed to be doing my homework. Those are all like inextricable experiences for me from like falling in love with the movies and like what they make you feel. And I think there's like a really interesting dichotomy nowadays, you see, where people have a relationship to media which is primarily escapist. And I think I watch a lot of escapist media too, but I think when I go to cinema, it's never for escapism. It's really for like, I want to watch something that will, you know, stimulate something in me and it will make me feel something. And for as long as I can remember, the sex scene has always been like a really powerful, memorable sight for that. And yeah, as talking about horniness as a lens, I think that's so good, because I think what a lot of this book is trying to argue is that it's the sex scene is like a site for erotic energy and like momentum, and that it isn't necessarily like an interruption in the everyday. And I think in a lot of times when we like skate through our lives through this like very disembodied automated fashion, and that's made deliberate, the sex scene refuses to let us do that. Like, even if it means that you sit up a bit or you feel a bit uncomfortable or you suddenly feel more aware of people in the room next to you, it does pause, it creates pause. And to me, that can fall into so many different types of experiences in film, and it's not just like linked to certain genres like the erotic thriller, although we love, yeah, we do love the erotic thriller.
Yeah, there's a really interesting way you talk about it in the book that I hadn't really thought about before, which is it kind of brings you into the public, right? Like it brings you into yourself and like your own body, but also in relation to other people. And that is why we're kind of embarrassed by it, right? Like we're suddenly aware of everyone else in the room.
Yeah, I think so. I have been talking about this anecdote quite a lot recently, but I just think it's so appropriate. I went to go watch Baby Girl in the cinema recently. Hands up if you've seen Baby Girl. It's a few people. So I don't want to like spoil it then for too many people who've not seen it. But yeah.
Hey now, some of us liked it.
It was a good movie is the top line. But so it was really interesting because the movie opens with a sex scene. So it really doesn't give you any time to sort of like ease your way into it. It's like, this is what the movie is about. And immediately I always feel like, I'm stressed because I'm watching this in public with other people, and I just like hate when people are not responding to a movie the way that they're supposed to be, but that's my problem. But yeah, and then immediately I see this girl in front of me, and then she starts going on her phone and starts going on Snapchat, and I'm like, oh no, like why is this happening? And I think it's that response, right, is that a lot of times when we see something now that makes us sit up and makes us aware that we're watching things with other people, we want to retreat. We want to go to like the little mobile home that we have and, you know, feel like this sort of semblance of control over a feeling that we've not been prepared to engage with. And yeah, I did in fact get up and put on my big boy pants. I was like, excuse me, could you please stop using your phone?
You did that.
Thank you.
How did it feel?
It was really scary.
I could never.
But then, right, I felt really vindicated because after I did it, like 5 minutes later in the film, there's a line where someone tells Nicole Kidman's character, "Are you addicted to your phone or something?" So, yeah. So I really saved her some embarrassment there.
Yeah, it would have been worse.
Yeah, exactly.
This kind of feeds in as well to, I think, a line of argument that runs throughout the whole book. I think is, again, I've never really thought about it in this way, but it's such a sort of powerful defense of the sex scene, which is this idea that the viewer is a body and the viewer is implicated in what they're seeing. And I think at the beginning of the first chapter, you're talking about the big advert that most of us can recognize as the View Omni.
Yes.
The big advert on the View Omni where it's like, oh, you can have this like recliner seat, and it's actually more about your experience as a body in the room than what you're watching. And a lot of this book talks about, right, like that sort of tension between us as passive viewers and us as people that are actively implicated in what's being seen.
Yeah, totally. I think this is something that really interests me. With that along the same lines as, you know, this discomfort that I sense with people wanting to retreat away from anything that doesn't feel escapist because it pulls them much more deeply into the present. Yeah, I thought it was so striking that a cinema would choose to market itself based on the chairs that it could allow you to sit in rather than what you could actually watch on screen. And that was an ad that I saw basically like every day going to work. And I was thinking, how have we gotten to this point where it's mostly about, you know, the body and how it feels in that space, but with no concern to what we're watching on screen and that relationship to our bodies? Because how has that gotten so flipped around? Because as far as like I'm concerned, the movies themselves have lost that connection to bodies. Like we get them very rarely, few and far between, but most of these movies that are being marketed, the ones that make the most money, the ones that are allowed to take up the most space, screening in multiplexes, are films that do not engage with viewers' bodies, you know, are doing its best to actually distance you from them with spectacle, with you know, violence that's very far removed and kind of spectacularized. And I just really wanted to bring that tension, I guess, back into frame about the ways in which our bodies are vessels for people to sell us products, right? And also how much of a difference it is coming to the cinema and expecting to, you know, completely just disengage from what's on screen, but be offered this, you know, like luxury kind of business plane seat kind of experience, but not really care about the content and what that's being, what the narrative is behind its refusal to engage with us as bodies anymore.
And then thinking about the kind of films that we are taught to watch, they're ones that to a certain extent might think about the body, but it's something that's being destroyed. And like you say, it's often in this very abstract way. Like we're very okay with violence. But the thing about the sex scene, I suppose, which sets it apart, is it's about pleasure and it's about desire. And that's like the radical thing about it, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think there's a study that I briefly draw on in the book, which looks at the statistical decline of the sex scene and then the inverse relationship of increasing like violence on screen. And this idea as well that when people look for mature films, that what they want is more violence and not more sex. And yeah, I'm just really interested in why that has come to be and what the reasoning is behind sort of dulling our abilities to feel and desire some things versus what we're being primed to accept politically. And when we talk about like the rise of the MCU, I'm sorry, I need to stop bragging on Marvel, but but it coincided with like the peak of the Iraq War, right? Like Iron Man came out at exactly the same time in order to sort of, you know, create manufactured consent for a war in the Middle East.
And it's set in the Middle East and it's about Middle Eastern terrorists, really explicitly, that first one.
And you're supposed to like root for like weapons manufacturers. You're supposed to believe that like it's a pro-social activity to invest in weapons for like under the guise of defending your nation. There's this whole like again, and with these movies you don't ever see human connection as being something that is ever enters the frame, right? And that may be saying it in a very like simplistic way, but I think there are certain types of behaviors that are espoused by those narratives, and a lot of the terrain that would allow the sex scene to even be thought possible in these films is disappearing.
Is this the time to talk about everyone's hot and no one's horny? Do you guys know about this? Do you want to tell the room?
Oh my gosh, so one of my favorite essays of all time is called Everyone's Beautiful and No One is Horny by Raquel S. Benedict, and it's on Blood Knife magazine, and if you've not read it, please do read it. But yeah, in this essay, Benedict kind of traces how it's not like bodies have been forgotten by the movies, but they've been fetishized at the same time as they've been desexed. So she talks about the scene in Starship Troopers, the Paul Verhoeven film, where all of these like pristine, muscular, ultra athletic bodies are like naked in a dressing room together, and yet all they talk about is like, how many people did I kill today? Like and you know, and it's like all these beautiful bodies in a room, and in her words, the only thing they're horny for is annihilation. And I think that that's just such a crystal clear diagnosis of a lot of how we deal with bodies today, and it's really sad, like the lack of real bodies, I guess, as well, that we're allowed to see on screen nowadays. And the fact that people put themselves as well through such paces to align with certain ideas of what a movie star body is, but then those same movie star bodies are not really allowed to fuck. They're only there to kind of put on suits that where a lot of their genital bulges have to be edited out of frame, by the way, if that doesn't make it more farcical. And yeah, there are certain things that our body is allowed to do. It has to look beautiful, but that beauty is not to be enjoyed by other people.
And then in the book you talk about it so well, where it's like, it's about the politics of sex, but then it's the politics of bodies more and how we think about them more broadly. So a lot of like this resistance to the sex scene, you talk about it as fitting within kind of broader movements in capitalism. You talk about Palestine a lot as well. Do you want to like sort of say how those things fit together and when you started first thinking about them?
Yeah, I guess it was a really, I was trying to connect all of these narratives in my head about, and I felt when I started writing that they were connected, this sort of decline of the sex scene, the decline of connective public spaces in general, decline of meaningful connection that exists outside of a capital transaction, and the way that people are able to completely like block out something that is happening that should be, you know, making us so angry and horrified that we burn everything to the ground. And to me, I guess I was really interested in teasing out how those things were linked. And this doesn't mean that I think the sex scene is the only way that we can understand how those things are linked, but it was like one way in. And I was really interested in the sex scene as, again, like a form of interruption. And especially when you're in the cinema, right, and you're not at home, no matter how uncomfortable it makes you, you have to sit there and watch it, even unless you leave, unless you get up and leave. But when we talk about the devices and the screens that we have nowadays, like there's a built-in avoidance mechanism, right? You just like scroll your thumb, and that is a reflex that has also dulled, I think, our ability to respond to real images of like bodily harm that should be making us despair, that should be moving us to action. And I think those things are all really linked the more that you kind of unpack them. What is our discomfort with seeing other bodies and having those bodies have an impact on our own? Why are we positioned in a way where we're not allowed to be moved? And I think that a lot of that, all of this, like this media and cultural apparatus is designed to keep us in those very isolated boxes where we feel like we're only responsible for ourselves and our own feelings, and that we should never allow like images of other people's bodies, whether that's of their pleasure, their joy, or their immense suffering, to move us beyond this model of the individualized and atomized consumer.
You talk about like the capacity of cinema and like art more broadly to enact liberation, and there's this really good bit where you're like, cinema and the sex scene are not the revolution, but that they can make possible, or they can make visible certain possibilities, I suppose. And I'm curious how you see that happening, and if there are particular films that you think of when you think of that.
Yeah, totally. I think it was really important for me to say that, because I am also really tired of people being like, uncritically saying like, queerness is resistance, queerness is revolution, or like watching a film is resistance and revolution, because it's often not. And that's not to deny the power or like the revolutionary intent or possibility that's contained with these things, but I want us to all sort of take a step back in and reflect a little bit on how much of our quote-unquote action nowadays is framed through the lens of consumption. And that's both for people, you know, people who also care a lot about, you know, not wanting to consume problematic art, quote-unquote. That's also another like arm of it, I think, where it's like our political action has been so constrained that it becomes only about what we allow ourselves to be seen buying or taking part in. But yeah, I think it was really important for me to draw the distinction that I am not trying to say that like the sex scene is going to cause revolution, but that it is a really important ideational resource. And I think any of us who engage with art or have been moved by it can in some way relate to that feeling of watching something and really feeling that kind of push you into another plane of existence or hope or possibility. And I think a culture where those resources are being we're being deprived of those resources is one where our imaginations are like necessarily hemmed in. And I just wanted to talk about the sex scene as a possibility of reconnecting with all of those things that we're taught to, you know, discard. And a lot of that is about, you know, connection and community. And the sex scene is always a collaborative encounter in some way, even if it is just like one person having sex with themselves. By you watching it on screen, you know, you're part of that encounter as well. So it is just like a fabric of connection, I think, in a way that a lot of other things don't have that same sort of like visceral impact that the sex scene can.
I think what I really love about that line of argument as well is it goes very against a lot of what anti-sex scene discourse is, which is revolves around this idea of functionality, right?
Yes.
Like what purpose is this doing? What like, oh, is it moving something along? Is that someone saying a line of dialogue? Can't they say it in some other way?
Yeah.
What are the dangers, do you think, of thinking about both art and sex through a lens of functionality?
Oh, I hate it. I hate it so much. I just think, again, it's so like symptomatic of our inability to assign value to anything nowadays outside commodification, right? Like this idea that, like you said, the line that most people sort of trot out in the anti-sex scene sphere is that the sex scene doesn't have a purpose, therefore it shouldn't be in the film. It doesn't contribute to the plot. And it's like, is a movie just supposed to be a Wikipedia article summary of what happens? Like, no, I think we would all agree that, you know, art should make us feel things. They shouldn't just be, you know, the most effective way of getting from point A to point B. You're not trying to take a shortcut to understanding what a story is. Yeah, I think this idea of functionality really speaks to a broader suspicion of pleasure and of things that are not easily subsumed under like capital systems of, you know, compartmentalizing something, understanding its use, understanding how it can be sold. And I think the sex scene really discomforts people because it cannot be subsumed into those things. And it reminds us that there are areas of our lives that do not have to be subsumed under some sort of capital transaction. And I think that is, you know, that hits home for some people.
Do you think it's also like a resistance to difficulty in any way?
Oh, yeah.
Like I'm thinking of, is it Catherine Angel that you talk about, Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again? And she talks in that book a lot about the idea of sex being bound up with power, and it always is, and that idea of trying to remove it from that is really destructive, and there is a certain element of like sometimes ambivalence or ambiguity or like a process in sex that we shy away from. Do you think people are also frightened of that in some ways?
Yes, absolutely. I think it's all hand in hand with this inability to sit with anything that does not have any like easy answers or simplicity now. And I think sex will never have an easy answer. And that's what Catherine Angel's book like really talks about, is that we will have to make and remake what it means to have good sex. There's never like a one size fits all way of doing that. Things will change from partner to partner, from day to day, like but I think a lot of us, and understandably so, we want solutions that will work, solutions that will protect people. And she talks a lot about like the consent framework and how, you know, feminists attach a lot of like utopian, I think, dreams to the idea that as long as we can make everyone understand that sex needs to be consensual, violence will never enter the bedroom or, you know, the office or wherever ever again. And that's clearly not been the case, right? And I think we have to be equipped to understand that ambivalence will always be a part of not just our sexual lives, but our lives in community with other people in general. And yeah, I think, like you said, the process of sex is something that I'm really interested in, because something about pornography, and I think what differentiates it from the sex scene, is that in porn, it's almost like so, it's like a play, right? It's like everyone has a role, and you kind of understand that there's only a few ways that this scenario can go. But it also prescribes what sort of gestures, what sort of actions, dynamics, relations are allowed in a certain scenario. And I think the sex scene is so powerful because it exceeds that. Like, it's not just a merely functional object that's trying to get you from point A, guy comes in the door, and then like we do our business and the viewer is happy and we're all done here. Like, it can be so much more complex than that, and some of my favorite sex scenes have really dealt with the ambivalence of entering into that space of wading through something quite murky together. And yeah, I think it's also really important for me to not align the argument of this book with sex positivity, which I think is a discourse that I've been recently very like reticent to engage with, because first of all, of how like commodified it's become. I feel like a lot of us have probably seen, or maybe it's just me, maybe it's my algorithm, but when you get like sex toy company ads, and they're all just like this really sleek, colorful or like pastel colored, infographic, smooth, you know what I mean? Like, it's also suggestive of this future where all friction has been removed and that we're no longer, you know, wading through something difficult and dark and complex, which it often still is despite our best efforts and our best wishes. I'm much more interested in finding a middle ground where sex does not have to be treated as some sort of unspeakable transgression, but it also, hopefully in a future where it also does not have to be exceptional, like that it can just be and that it can just exist without having to without us having to rush to its defense and therefore like sanctify it as exceptional in some way. So even though it is a book about the sex scene and how much I love it and how much I care for it, in one way I also wish that we didn't have to have that conversation, and that it would just be accepted both in art and in life as something non-exceptional.
Yeah, there's a real like religious undertone, I think, too. A
Yeah.
lot of, not just like in terms of the morality, but also in terms of how the argument is structured of these things, where it's like either it's sinful and terrible, or it's like this beautiful, transcendental, sanctified
Yes.
between man and wife.
Yeah.
And I think that this is and it reminds me actually a lot of some of the criticisms that came out about the film of Call Me By Your Name, which I love. But that compared to the book, there was so much like bodily fluids in the book that the film
That's
just
so
like
true.
skated over, right?
Yeah.
Like there's this kind of romanticization we sometimes have towards it.
Yeah, and the aestheticization of sex as well, that, you know, it has to be beautiful in some way, in a very sort of like polite way. Which is why, again, like, not to go back to Baby Girl, but I thought that that was like one of the films I've seen recently where sex was allowed to be sort of like bestial and ugly, and sound quite scary.
And also they're bad at it.
And yeah, they're
But,
allowed
like, in
to
a
be
really
bad at
way,
it.
Yeah, where he's like, oh, get on the ground or whatever, and then he just starts laughing.
Yeah,
He's like, that sounded so
exactly.
stupid.
Yeah, and I think we sort of are unfortunately so unable to talk about sex that the idea that we don't know how to do it or that we would feel lost or unsure is then out of the picture, and then you have people having to, you know, pretend that they enjoy doing things that they don't, and that to me is just like a huge tragedy and just really, really sad and shouldn't be happening.
Do you think there's an element to which cinema is moving back, like this need for moral clarity? We're moving back to, like, essentially like how old Hollywood functioned. Like, I'm thinking of the Hays Code. I'm thinking of the studio system as well, the way the actors are now like owned by Netflix and just shuffled between shows.
Yeah, it's really interesting because in some ways I feel like even during the Hays Code there were people a little bit more committed to doing transgressive stuff. Like, I think now a lot of times people are just like have sort of capitulated to it a bit more, whereas during the Hays Code at least some people, you know, were coming up with really inventive ways to still talk about sex and present erotic scenes in films without you know, going to jail, or I don't actually know how they were prosecuted for it, but yeah, I think there is this increasing like moral puritanism, which is really interesting to me because, again, like, on first glance we think we're already in a sort of quote unquote sex positive era where we're already transparent about sex, that people feel okay to talk about it. Things like power dynamics and consent and things are, you know, in the timeline of human history, very, very recent developments and language that we've only recently started to think about in the mainstream. But yeah, I think there's a huge gap between where we say we are and where we actually are and what people are prepared to feel. And I don't know if it's regressive or if it's like a cycle. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, do you have any ideas about like why we're in the situation that we're in? Like, what are the kind of determining political and social factors that have created this suspicion of the sex scene and this suspicion, I suppose, of like pleasure and desire generally?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's such a boring answer, but it's like capitalism. And I think it all started with the discourse of like the atomized individual becoming the unit, like the unit of the family, the unit of the nuclear family specifically, and that being your sort of corner of the world, and that's the only thing that you should care about, and you take care of your own turf, and no one else is your concern. And I think that's what trickles down into every single one of our interactions, into a lot of our beliefs and our attitudes, and also this suspicion that if we're not commodifying or monetizing or selling anything, that it is inherently worthless. Also, this idea that the reason why we are taught to be suspicious of pleasure is because if we realize how much pleasure is being drained from our lives, how little time and capacity we have for it, how much we are made to sort of calculate it as a zero sum with our survival, with our friends' survival, with, you know, monetarily, with like rent, whether we even have a safe place to sleep at night, let alone, have sex. It's like all of these things, I think, root back to the position of the atomized individual as a consumer under capitalism and not as like a political subject. And I think those shifts towards insularity, towards consumerism, are indicative of all of the retreats that we have from public life and from social life that make us uncomfortable with sex.
There's also, I think, this element of like, we've kind of shifted within culture to thinking that like depicting something is somehow tacitly approving of it, right?
Yeah.
Which is the end point of representation politics. Do you want to talk about, your lambasting of
my
representation
gripes,
politics? Your gripes, your hater moment.
Yeah. Maybe I'll also like read a little bit more from that section that I. Oh yes, please. Thank you. So I'm going to start where I left off from page 67. Culture is an important field where homonormativity, theorized by the academic Lisa Duggan, is reproduced. The idea that good queers can be incorporated into the neoliberal nation-building project, which spans everything from access to the heteronormative good life, consumerism, monogamous marriage, home ownership, and raising children, to demanding that queers have the right to serve in the military. The homonormative regime of media representation, where inclusion or belonging in the dominant structure is the end goal and the limit of our imagination, goes hand in hand with a queer political program which accepts the terms and options made available by our oppressors. Today, popular queer politics has become about appealing to the government to distribute our rights, our healthcare, our seat at the blood-stained table as queers, surrendering to the nation-state as gatekeeper of the lives we do or do not deserve to live. Queer identity has also been enlisted to justify wars, to position the liberated and free West as superior to the sexually backward Middle East, to close liberal ranks around genocidal politicians who must stay in power because queer people at home are more important than queer people being bombed by our governments. If this is queerness, I don't want it. I'm instead drawn to queer theorist Jose Esteban Munoz's declaration that queerness is not yet here, that it is what tells us this world is not enough. This recalls Audre Lorde's writing on the power of the erotic, which she understood as a grave responsibility projected from within each of us, not to settle for the convenient, the shoddy, the conventionally expected, nor the merely safe. The queer erotic connects this internal feeling to an expansive, outward-reaching desire to bring forward new worlds for ourselves and those who we are in relation with. To Munoz, queerness is the knowledge that the past is a realm of possibility, available to us in the present to aid the dawn of a new futurity, a folding so that all three corners touch. The queer sex scene is an aesthetic artifact that enacts this very touching. The sprawling timeline of the films discussed herein is evidence itself against the teleological narrative of LGBT pragmatism's rights-based progress. Sometimes there is more futurity to be found in glancing backwards to 70 years ago, which may, in the sex scene's ability to bring us closer in time and space to queer sensations, subjects, and desires, equip us to transcend the standstill of the present. These queer sex scenes are examples of what the anthropologist Gail Rubin calls scary sex, to fuck in a way that crosses the line between sexual order and chaos, invoking the establishment sphere that something unspeakable will skitter across. Yes, these are orgies, public sex, sex with the wrong bodies, sex full of sin, sex across political lines. But just as importantly, they are creative texts about how to fuck against the state together, about evading surveillance, capture, and assimilation. Munoz describes how certain queer art allows us to understand our desire for politics alongside the politics of desire. The unspeakable thing that skitters across may be no less than a reclamation of our collective power. Thank you.
Yeah, it really makes me think of this, the distinction between queerness as like an identity, almost like a thing that we're, like a brand identity that we're like fitting into, and then queering as a verb, like this kind of action that we are taking to kind of queer structures across our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's precisely it, right? It's like this process of defanging what is most powerful about queer as like a political project, and as soon as you make something identitarian, and more about labeling certain people, about a project to identify who is part of this community and who is not, then you really do away with its exciting capacity for, remaining unassimilable, and for it to, just be something that cannot be defined, something that cannot be clearly captured is what is most threatening to systems of control that depend on your capacity to be pinned down and to be trapped in a certain way in your imagination of what's possible for you.
And then I have a couple more questions, and I'll hand it over to you guys. But it makes me think about, you talk about the Matrix, which I know.
Oh my gosh,
I know
yes.
The Matrix. And Sense8 as well, which oh my god, Sense8, the orgy scenes in Sense8 were iconic. And it makes me think about the possibilities of genre and the role that genre has to play, and especially sci-fi as a genre that can kind of imagine new worlds. Do you think it's particularly positioned to then be able to imagine beyond these structures that we have?
I think it's definitely a very powerful tool. I feel like I'm a bit of an omnivore. I just love all genres, and the amazing thing is that also up till recently it was so normal to see the sex scene across all genres as well. Now I'm you very rarely see a film of the Matrix's scale contain a sex scene. And that's what was so powerful about that sex scene. It's one of the first ones that I write about in the book is in The Matrix Reloaded. Hands up if you've seen The Matrix Reloaded. A couple more people. But I love that movie. And a fun fact about that movie is that the sex scene in it, which is this beautiful rave where basically the last remaining humans underground in the city of Zion have been told that the machine army is going to arrive the next day and annihilate them. And they decide to have a rave. And a lot of people are like, that's dumb. I wouldn't do that. And it's first of all, I think you need to enter the Wachowskis universe and be taken along for that ride to understand that actually, no, yes, what is the most important thing for us to be doing in this scenario would be to affirm our humanity and affirm our connection to each other. And to me, that's one of the most powerful scenes in sci-fi, period. Even though it is a rave of barefoot people stomping the ground, it's not all of that cool, slick stuff that happens in The Matrix. It's the real life people who are, on the edge of a war that might lead to human extinction. And they decide that the most important thing that they need to do is to connect to the erotic, connect to the force that binds all of them together, that makes life worth living, that makes humanity worth fighting for. And I think that's a particularly powerful intervention in sci-fi or in genres where you often submit to the tendency to valorize things like technology and weaponry and a very sort of cerebral and masculinized approach to human interaction. And the Wachowskis are always looking for opportunities to dismantle that. And I think even with Sense8 as well, it's at every single opportunity, and I think Lana describes it as all of her narratives are a form of assault against what narratives are assumed to be static.
That's such a nice place to leave it. I had a question about capitalism, but one day, right? I'm going to hand it over to you guys, though, just to make sure that you have time. So does anyone, I can get this mic over to anyone.
If you just repeat people's questions.
Okay, I can repeat the question. So if you want to yell, well, put up your hand first and then yell at me.
This will be the third time you've been asked to put your hands up.
Yeah. Sorry to make it school. Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you so much.
There's so many lines I can't stop thinking about, but for some reason, I keep thinking about, are you ready to fuck the system?
Oh.
And I just wanted to ask you first, the line that you can't stop thinking about all the
Oh my gosh.
If you could pick just
Okay. So that's such a good question. So they've been thinking a lot about the line, was it, are you ready to fuck the system? And whether you have a line that's kind of sat with you a lot while writing the book.
I don't know if I have like a line specifically, and I'm really grateful you like that, because I was like, when I was writing it, I was like, is this corny? But I'm quite a corny person, so it's okay. And hopefully, if you read it and you go along for the rest of the ride, like you feel like it's earned the corniness. I didn't expect it to be the most memorable bit because I really struggled with it, but I actually really am glad to have written the conclusion that I did. I think when I was writing the conclusion, it was in a particularly like difficult time. I mean, I think as most of us in this room will have experienced, like the past 18 months has been some of the most like emotionally exhausting times to just like be alive and be doing things that seem so distant and not relevant or worthwhile to something as violent as like a genocide that's being like live streamed to us. I think I was really struggling with that writing this and coming to the end, but then I feel like with the conclusion I was able to talk a little bit and convince myself a little bit of at least some of its worth as a project. But I don't know if there was like a specific line. I think it's not even about the sex scene, but I think I was really inspired by reading about the methods of resistance in Gaza and the way in which, something as simple as a condom that's been filled with flammable liquid thrown across the border wall, and it's enough to send like the settlers scurrying. The way that, people are still having babies and like raising families in Gaza amidst so much destruction. To me, all of that was like so affirming, the fact that life goes on despite all of this unimaginable like grief and violence, and I think spiritually that's where I wanted the book to end up, so I'm glad that it got there somehow.
It's really beautiful. The conclusion is gorgeous. Gigi.
I have a question from the online chat.
Huge.
What are the sex scene cliches that you really hate?
Oh, that's a really good question.
What are the sex scene cliches that you really hate?
See, I'm such a perv. I like most things. I think one thing I'm increasingly not into is music being played over a sex scene. Because a lot of times I think the music is being used to sort of insulate you from feeling discomfort. And I think it's something really interesting if you go back and really pay attention to what the music is doing. A lot of times it is there to either provide like comic relief or to like already teach you, or not teach you, but like predispose you to feel a certain way about it. I think it's a bit of a cheat. This is not to say that there have not been iconic like songs being played over sex scenes, but I think increasingly I'm like, let's be brave, we can ditch the music.
Ditch the playlist.
Yeah.
Not time for it. Do we have any other questions? Yeah, at the back.
Oh yeah, first, really good talk, thank you so much. I
Thank
just had
you.
a question about, you talked about how a lot of the arguments against the sex scene was about how they don't serve a lot of function in the narrative. My question was, part of that argument that I hear from people is that a lot of the times when the sex scenes are there and they don't serve a lot of function in the narrative, they're there to objectify women, in that a lot of times the women are more undressed in these scenes, or the camera and the footage focus more on women in these scenes. And I just wanted to hear what your thoughts were about that argument against the sex scene.
Yeah, so I'm going to try and sum that up, probably not very coherently like you did. But thinking about how some of the arguments against the sex scene, it's about that functionality, but it's also about the fact that women are often very like objectified in them, and how you feel about that argument and maybe what you would say in response.
Yeah, this is a really, really good question and a very like thorny topic, and I do try and talk about it in the chapter, which is about the sex scene under patriarchy, and I explicitly sort of examine how some of the argument against the sex scene has been derived from this like post-Me Too as well awareness of the fact that sexual violence is not only potentially like immortalized on screen, but that it happens throughout the production process, and all of these behind the scenes things are now like brought to light in a way that makes a lot of us much more uncomfortable with what the sex scene could represent. And I think absolutely like to look at the history of the sex scene and the movies in general is to look at the history of the objectification of women and of image making of people of marginalized genders and races and all sorts of different processes of objectifying people. But I think something that really stood out to me and the way that I decided to think through this problem is, what are the targets of our political ire, I guess? And to me, sometimes it feels a bit misplaced. And I talk a bit about the anti-porn movement during the 70s, and how there was like a big rift in the feminist movement between anti-porn feminists and pro-porn feminists. And there was a line that really stuck with me from a pro-porn feminist talking to an anti-porn feminist, where she said, you guys are just afraid of attacking the real thing, so you go after the image of what oppresses you and not what actually oppresses you. And I don't necessarily think that that's like, you know, the be-all and end-all of what is a very, very complicated and thorny process. But I think this idea that we attach so much more political weight to images and to things that are related to our consumption of these things, rather than devoting a lot of that focus and energy to changing the systems that allow such a symptom to occur, was probably the way that I started thinking about this most productively. But yeah, it is a difficult one, and I hope I like talk about it enough in the book. But yeah.
I think it's also like, even in that title of the chapter, right? Like, it's a sex scene under patriarchy. It's not the sex scene. Like, that doesn't have to be inherent to depicting sex, right?
Yeah, totally. I think I don't ever want to posit the sex scene as like a utopian thing far removed from the systems of power that it's like imbricated with. So talking about the sex scene is also about how it can provide alternatives to those types of violent images and restrictive images and narratives of what sex can be. And I think, hopefully, someone agreed outside. Get them in here. But hopefully, I mean, if a lot of people are in this room, it's also because you believe in the sex scene and its ability to like make you feel something, and also that it's also what's the word? I don't want to say instructive, because it's not like it's trying to like teach you how to have sex, but that you sense a certain sense of possibility, right? That you don't get from other depictions of sex. And I think that that is probably a very useful ally for us to have under patriarchy instead of doing away with it.
We have Helen, yes.
Hi. Now, I asked this question as a writer rather than a filmmaker, but I think it can be like a lot of crossover and things we are discussing. Specifically, as someone who writes both poetry and fiction, that's a lot to do with queer relationships and queer sex. I was wondering, do you have, what would be your like one piece of like advice or something you would like to see from someone who does that kind of picked work?
So like, as a writer who writes a lot within like kind of queer relationships, queer sex, what is the one thing that you would like to see from people working within these mediums and writing these things?
Wow, it's a very I'm honored to be asked this question, and I don't feel like I have the authority to be directing anyone's creative practice. But I guess to me, if I approach it from like what I find most inspiring is, I think queer poetry and queer art needs to resist the temptation to become palatable and to become commodifiable. I think there's been a lot of push recently to devise queer art that we know will sell. And I would love it if all of us rejected those terms. And I mean, obviously we have to survive, and you know, we need to like make, survive in some way and be able to make some money out of the things that we create. But if we can collectively, you know, expand the terms of what's possible, I think that's a really beautiful project. Is to remain fluid, remain unassimilable, to constantly keep inventing, to resist the stasis of, you know, having an externally defined concept of what queerness can be. And that is a very vague answer, but that's a queer answer too. So.
I think we have time for one more question. Do we have one more? Okay, I guess I'll ask my question about capitalism.
Amazing.
Since you guys insist. Which actually feeds really well into this. Is it possible to create art or to create films or cinema within an industry, essentially, that is truly radical? Like, if you are making a film because of the way that art is inherently commodifiable, because of how Hollywood functions, because of how even independent film functions, what are some of the ways that we can, or that filmmakers can be radical if they are working within, like, its labor and its industry, right?
Yeah, this is the biggie. But I guess to me, even if the answer is no, I don't actually think of that as being a very pessimistic thing to say, because I think it's always been that it's incumbent on the people who engage with the art to do the radical thing. And for the filmmakers, for the artists, for the creatives, to lead us somewhere, to give us these feelings, to create a surplus of meaning that art can create, but that the rest is up to us. And so it used to keep me up a lot at night, this question, especially as someone who, you know, like really, really loves movies, really, really loves art, wants to believe in its power, really to change the world. And I do think it can, but that it's not operating in isolation. And every time that I've seen a radical piece of art or film move someone to action, that's where that power lies, is in that transition from it just being something to be consumed to something that activates you to do something differently.
That's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and for your questions. There's a signing table.
So there will be a signing table in the next room. If we just let Anahi and Xuanlin come through, and then you guys can go get your book signed.
Great. You can ask them about challenges. I would advise you do so.